Welcome to the fall lecture series for 2025, brought to you to this season by Impact Employment Solutions. My name, as always, is Carrie Soden. I am the Director of Archaeology and Research here at the National Museum of the Great Lakes. Again, as always, thank you for signing up and showing up. Please don't forget, you can still give at nmgl.org/donate. This is our second lecture series in our new Great Lakes Community Education Center. Isn't it lovely? Everybody's like, yeah. Doesn't your butt feel better on those nice soft seats? See what you guys are missing online? Come in person. Good new soft seats. So as I said, tonight's the first of our fall lecture series. Don't forget, for those of you online, if you need closed captions, just turn them on with the control bar at the bottom of your screen. If you have any issues with the Zoom portion, please log out and log back in. That tends to fix most of the problems the users have. If anything were to happen to your feed tonight, we are taping this evening and we will be putting it up on our YouTube channel by Monday morning, and a link will get sent out to all of you registered as to how to see that. As always, we will have a Q&A period at the end of the talk. For those of you online, please post in the Q&A. For those of you here in the room, just, raise your hand. We'll get you. I am very excited tonight. I mean, for those of you that have been attending for a long time, you know that I've been running this part of the program for, I don't know, a bunch of years now. And I'm always excited when I get to invite somebody I know and admire and who is a friend and a colleague of mine to come speak. Walter Lewis holds an MA in history from Queen's University in Kingston. Currently, he serves as the production editor for the Northern Mariner. I'm good at Le Marin du Nord. There you go. I don't speak French. Which is the Journal of Canadian Nautical Research Society and the North American Society for Oceanic History. He's best known in the Great Lakes community for the maritime history of the greatlakes.ca website, which he has managed since 1998. In 2008, Dundum Press published The River Palace, The Many Lives of the Kingston, which he co-authored with Rick Nielsen. In 2023, he was awarded the Association for Great Lakes Maritime's History's C. Patrick Labadie Award for Historic Preservation. Another winner of that award? Me. Sorry, just no. I was just more of like this, maybe they give it to everybody. No. He has presented on a variety of contexts, including a Great Lakes cruise ship on a range of topics, both historical and on the technical side of digital content management in the cultural sector. He's currently a member of the executive committees for the Toronto Marine Historical Society, the Canadian Nautical Research Society, and the Association for Great Lakes Maritime History, and serves on the advisory board of the National Museum of the Great Lakes. Tonight, he's going to talk to us about transports and blockade runners, Great Lakes steam at sea in the Civil War. During the Civil War, several vessels built for the service on the Great Lakes were put to work in the transport service on the American coast, on the Atlantic coast. None came back. Some, it was suspected, had been acquired by agents of the Confederate government as blockade intrigue followed. Dun, dun, dun. And then, so Walter, come on over and thank you.
During the time I wrote the blurb and I was doing further research on this, I've given this presentation in a limited fashion before to a couple of Civil War roundtables, Canadian Civil War roundtables, which you might wonder why the heck are Canadians. I'm Canadian here, to full disclosure. And there were some 5 figures worth of Canadians that fought in the American Civil War. There are also draft dodgers that showed up in Canada during the course of the Civil War. So we were engaged on both sides of that exercise. And I discovered that a couple of things that I said in that blurb are wrong, and I will correct them as we go through here. So when we talk about the Civil War on the Great Lakes, the first point is that there was some activity here, the prisoners' war camp on Johnson's Island, which is off Sandusky. We're not talking about that. There was an effort by a group of Confederate and Confederate sympathizers to seize the Philo Parsons, the object of which was to go and to seize the USS Michigan and to go perhaps to help those prisoners of war to escape. It's a really interesting story, and I'm not going to talk about that. What I want to talk about is the Civil War and Great Lakes steamers that went to sea. And where I started with this was Eric Heil's article that appeared in Inland Seas back in the winter of 1959 as the centennial was starting to wrap up. for these events. I just by way of note, inland seas, those first 75 years of inland seas are online now at inlandseas.nmgl.org. And so the screenshot you see there is from that article online. So let's talk about a bit about naval vessels, some blockade runners, some privateers, some army transports. And what this is going to be is a collection of short stories. So we'll talk about one vessel, then we'll move on to talk another vessel. So we won't get bored with any one of them too long, with any hope. And I'm going to throw in a few vessels that came to the lakes that were involved in the Civil War, but came to the lakes afterwards, because some of them are interesting. And then some conclusions. So at the start of the war, General Winfield Scott, who was a Virginian who happened to be in charge of the U.S. Army and stayed loyal, but was retired fairly soon. He had this idea that the way to end the conclusion, bring things to a rapid conclusion, was to blockade the southern ports and send the U.S. Army down where the head of that snake is, down the Mississippi River. He did not call it the Anaconda Plan, but what it's become known as. So this is kind of a political cartoon saying, really? You're going to be able to pull that off? And this is what some people thought of the capacity of the U.S. Navy in order to enforce a blockade. And there they are out in their wash tubs, firing things, and there's CSS Nashville coming out to discuss matters with them. So there's not a lot of confidence in the competence of the U.S. Navy at that particular stage. Now, this is one of the things that most accounts of the Civil War tend to tread lightly on or to overlook altogether. So I want to point out a couple of things here. I'm not going to use the pointer because the people online can't see it. So you're just going to have to, and I'm not going to wave at either one of these screens. So you're just going to have to, I'll try and describe this. There are 4 forts that were on the shores of the Confederacy that the federal forces retained at the beginning of the war and kept throughout the entire stretch of the war. There is Fort Pickens, which is at Pensacola, which is the far western end of the Panhandle in Florida. There's Fort Jefferson, that's way out in the Gulf, and I won't name the Gulf because your government and my government has different ideas as to what it should be called. So it's out in the dry Tortugas. Fort Taylor, which is in Key West, down at the end of the Keys. And most importantly, Fort Monroe, which is in Hampton Roads there at the entrance to the Chesapeake Bay and directly across from Norfolk, Virginia, and the naval base there. So, and of course, these they kept, but many of them were turned over. And of course, we all know that Fort Sumter wasn't immediately turned over, let us merely say. But the other point I want to make, so there's these 4 forts that the federal forces, the Union has retained throughout the entire course of the war. It has to be supplied. Okay, so you have to get food, etc., to them. In addition to that, there were a whole series of combined operations in the first 2 years of the war. And I'm going to do this by date, which means we're going to jump around a bit geographically. First of all, there was the inlet at Hatteras. So just south of Cape Hatteras, there's a way to get into Pamlico Sound. And it's, off the coast of North Carolina there. Hoping with this audience, if I say a state, you'll be good with me. Port Royal, which is between Savannah and Charleston, and for the people who don't understand Port Royal, perhaps, Beaufort or Hilton Head, where everybody, at least all the Canadians go down and go golfing, right? St. Augustine on the Florida coast. New Bern, which is off the south end of Pamlico Sound in North Carolina. And it's that big green jog that comes in there in North Carolina because it's well up the Neuse River. New Orleans is taken in April of '62 as they force their way past the forts that guard. New Orleans is one of those really tricky things to retain during the war because the Confederates were worried that if the Union forces attacked, that they'd break the levees and flood the town. When the Union took it, they were worried that the Confederates would attack, break the levees, and flood the town. New Orleans is sinking. Sorry, that's a Canadian band, so you may not have met them. Finally, and you see the Peninsular Campaign there in the lower right of this particular image. Norfolk, Virginia, which is opposite Fort Monroe there, was taken at the same time as McClellan was marching up the peninsula and marching back down again. And they kept Norfolk, Virginia and the naval spaces there for the rest of the war. So there's all of these places scattered around that they kept throughout the war. In addition to that, they took Jacksonville, gave it back, took it again. Jacksonville, I think there's 3 or 4 times it changed hands during the war. And Galveston, they took in October of '62, and it was retaken by the Confederacy in January of '63. So you have all of these places that were part of those combined operations during the first 2 years of the war. McClellan gets fired, and there doesn't seem to be the same kind of interest in those engagements. But then you have this, part of the reason you take them, for example, Port Royal, at Beaufort, you have the railroad line that runs between Savannah and Charleston. So you can really mess up things when you start taking chunks out of the railways. But it also gives you places where you can resupply the blockading fleet. So you can run for shelter, you can get back out there. And if you can because the blockade has to work, and the blockade did work. We'll be talking about the blockade more, of course, the evening. But really, in this case, a lot of what we're talking about is supply. So I keep looking at this, and I see cattle, I see pigs. And this is supposed to be at the end on the right, the left-hand side there, Lee Perrin's sauce, who I'm assuming was an advertiser in the illustrated paper where this came from. I'm thinking that there was a higher degree of proof in what mostly went down as part of the supply exercise. So there was stuff that people were more interested in drinking here. So anyway, let's start on the Union side of the equation. We're going to start with the Uncle Ben. Uncle Ben, Ben Bidwell was a veteran shipbuilder in Buffalo, and the tug was named after him. And it went to work hauling schooners and larger sailcraft between Lake Erie and Lake Huron. In fact, it was owned by a company that had bought up a whole lot of these things and had bought 3 tugs to facilitate just their fleet between Lake Erie and Lake Huron. So this is a big, powerful tug designed to haul all sorts of strings of schooners up and down the Detroit and the St. Clair rivers. The problem was that the company that bought all of these schooners ran into the Panic of 1857. It's a major economic downturn. We'll hear the Panic of '57 over and over and over again because it messed with shipping on the Great Lakes significantly, partly because it came at the same time that all of these railroads had opened, increasing the supply of transport services on offer at the same time that the panic killed demand. So you got a lot of people going bankrupt, including the owners of the Uncle Ben. So it was sold off at auction, and it was sent in the summer of '59 down to Boston, where it was going to be a harbor tug in Boston. And then along comes the Civil War, the fuss in Fort Sumter, and the Union government decided they needed to send down a fleet to salvage the situation in some fashion. And if you look down the list of the vessels, so there's the Navy sending something. The third one there is a revenue cutter, the Harriet Lane. And then we have a number of transports and then 2 tugs, including Uncle Ben. So here's a Great Lakes tug. It's gone to sea, and it's going to go and help rescue the folks at Fort Sumter. And if you read the really fine print, they were sending along 30 launches, which I suspect what it was intended to tow in to the fort there, because some of those naval vessels couldn't get in that close. Well, it took a while to organize this expedition, and Sumter was surrendered pretty quickly because it was frankly not well defended against the artillery that the Confederates were throwing at it. So Uncle Ben turns around, has mechanical problems, and puts into Wilmington, North Carolina. Remember, North Carolina has seceded. This, and the crew and the officers were seized as spies. And the Confederacy goes, "Oh, good, there's a really useful marine engine here that we could use in something. And we don't know what to do with the tug, but what the heck? We will come back to the Uncle Ben here. So when we come back to the Uncle Ben, you know we're close to the end. But we're going to move on here to America, which was built by the Niagara Harbor and Dock Company at the foot of the Niagara River by one of the most famous Canadian shipwrights on the Great Lakes, Louis Chacluna. It caught America and her sister ship Canada were money pits in the same way as many of the railroad steamers on Lake Erie were money pits. And they cost $250,000 each, and they lost money every day they ran. So the railroad sold them off and they were sent down the river. Now, these are really, really large boats. They are much too large for the St. Lawrence canals. So you run them down the river. You take them down the rapids of the St. Lawrence. And they were doing that with 183-foot vessels. This one had about 60 or 70 feet on that, and they got her down, sent her to sea. In fact, she's picked up by somebody who was in the business of taking people across the isthmus in Mexico. And so they renamed it Coatzacoalcos or something close to that. My Mexican isn't up to that. So if some of you afterwards can whisper in my ear what it was. But she ran from New Orleans down to the mouth of the Coatzacoalcos River. You then trekked your way across Mexico, caught another steamer, and went up to the San Francisco. During the spring of 1860, she was chartered to take delegates to the Democratic Convention in Charleston, and you could live on board her, which is a good thing because Charleston was kind of crowded. That was the Democratic Convention, but they were playing both sides here, so that when Lincoln is being inaugurated in March of 61, you could go down, and that was $8 was each way. $16 is a lot of money. That's a working man making $1 a day. That's half a month's wages in order to go for a ride down to Washington to see the inauguration. Right after the inauguration, Texas seceded the day before Lincoln was inaugurated, and she was sent down to Texas to help bring the troops home. Most of the officers were already Southern, and they were busy handing over the arsenals but they were bringing back. So she was sent down to bring back 700 men from Indianola, Texas. Has anybody ever been to Indianola, Texas? It's really hard to do because it's a ghost town now. So that's as much as you were ever going to see of Indianola, Texas. Came back to New York, where it was then ferrying troops from New York and places in New England down to Annapolis, where they then were marching to Washington via Baltimore. And you wonder why the federal troops got off and went marching through Baltimore instead of just going down to the Potomac, because they were trying to prevent Maryland from seceding. And there were riots in Baltimore where these federal troops were sent in to keep Maryland because remember, it's south of the Mason-Dixon line. Maryland is a slave state. So she went off with a troop of Rhode Island's folks with Colonel Ambrose Burnside on board. Now, once upon a time, those were mutton chops or side whiskers, but the troops started calling them Burnsides, and we know them as sideburns. That's where it comes from. They hated the name Coatzacoalcos. Just giving them toothaches, saying, well, it used to be America. And the accommodations, according to the troops, were execrable, and at least 300 of us had to bunk the best way we could. Now, compare that to somebody where they were advertising who said, amongst other things, it's a splendid side wheel steamship. It's the finest steamer in these waters, fitted up with every convenience in superb style, which apparently is true unless you're a private. So I mentioned Cape Hatteras. I think at one point that we were going to pass Cape Hatteras several times. It's on that expedition to Port Royal in October, November 1861, and there is a hurricane off Cape Hatteras. And these guys are convinced they're going to die. In fact, if you read very quickly, you'll see that the captain of the ship informed Colonel Rich she'd probably go down. So and the men on board in their reminiscence afterwards said they'd rather have stood the fire of 20 gunboats than venture to sea again in a shattered craft. So After that expedition, she was actually used in 1862 when they ferried all those men over the Peninsular Campaign. She was ferrying prisoners of war back again. They put 1,050 people on board a former Great Lakes steamboat. That's so far beyond an illegal size under normal circumstances, but these are ex-prisoners of war. They just happen to be going north again. They officially changed the name to America again, and I'm sorry about the fuzziness of the one on the right, but the editors were happy that they no longer had to say Coatzacoalcos. So am I. But she didn't spend the whole war there. She was actually put back on the run from New York City to Nicaragua in this particular case, and then was sent around the Horn and ran. So Great Lakes steamboat, paddle wheeler, paddle all the way around South America in order to work between Nicaragua and California. And she finally burned the Nicaraguan port less than 4 weeks after the Transcontinental Railway opened. I'm not suspicious, you may be. Okay, Peerless. Peerless is kind of interesting. It's the only iron-hulled one that served on the lakes before the war. It was built in Scotland on the Clyde by Alexander Denny and his brother, and was shipped over in something between 5,000 and 6,000 pieces, reassembled at that same shipyard in Niagara. And here you can see her in the foreground here. This is the Prince of Wales on his famous tour of 1860. That would be the prince that became Edward VII, who was the longest serving Prince of Wales until Charles. Because both of them had mothers that simply would not turn over the job, right? Anyway, that's Peerless in the foreground. And you can see the thing I would just have you notice is Kingston and New Era that are in behind in this picture. You see how they have an extra deck? Peerless looks like it's ready to go to sea. This is something you could take to sea. And that's what the Confederates thought. So they actually sent agents up north with specific instructions to look at Peerless, because Peerless had been sitting around since the crash of 1857, looking for a job. And apart from coming out briefly during that tour, they hadn't spent much time there. And they got blocked by the riots there in Baltimore getting north. And by the 1st of May, they said, well, we can't get it. Somebody else has got it. Now, that's not necessarily what was thought in Washington. So here's Roscoe Conklin, who is a serious Republican supporter who's busy reading people's telegrams. So he sends off a note to Abraham Lincoln saying, a man by the name of Wright of New York is secretly negotiating with Clark Gamble, who held the mortgage on Peerless, for the purchase of the steamship Peerless. Gamble telegraphed him Friday that an offer from Washington was pending. Now, the problem with an offer from Washington is the fact that all the senior officers, or many of the senior officers in the Quartermaster General's department, which would be the ones who would buy a transport, have moved south. So who Gamble thought he was negotiating with, I don't know. They didn't know who he was talking to. Who's this Wright guy? But Seward, who is the Secretary of State, is talking to the British ambassador, Lord Lyons, and saying the president received information believed to be authentic. It's that telegram I just showed you, that the iron steamer Peerless is in the hands of the enemy on her way out of Lake Ontario, and that she has regular British papers. Well, that's a serious extension of what was in that telegram. And they were going to draft an order to the Navy to seize it under any flag with any papers. Now, in the War of 1812, there was a lot of, lead up to that, there was a lot of fuss over British inspecting American vessels at sea, turnabout. Anyway, they had information that she'd been sold to the Southern insurgents. And you see those kinds of terms early in the war, insurgents, it has taken on a whole new meaning in the last few years. So who was Wright? It turns out he was born in Britain, but he had been in the US since the 1820s and had been sailing between New York, Charleston, New York, New Orleans, Galveston, had supplied transports during the Mexican War. He was well known in the South. He had then spent 10 years in California, along with 3 of his sons, all of whom were steamboat captains. But by 1859, he had sold out and retired to a spot in New York. Nobody in the city knew him. He was out in Throg's Neck, which is, who in New York knows somebody who's living out near the Bronx, right? So, but that's John Bully Wright, okay? He looks like his nickname. So the solution to the problem was, as far as the British was concerned, it had been sold to Wright. So it no longer qualified for British papers. It's not up to us to give it a clearance. The American consul, who's Josh Giddings, who is a rabid abolitionist congressman who has been assigned from Ashtabula, who's been assigned by Lincoln to be the consul general in British North America. And he says, I will not give you clearance to sail unless I put the crew on it. So I know where it's going. It's not going to go off somewhere where it can go to the Confederates. So she ends up in New York. And the fact is, Wright was happy to make money from whomever. So it was then chartered for $8,250 for 15 days work, which is good money when you can get it, or $550 a day for that expedition down to Port Royal. The one, remember that they had the hurricane that almost sank the Coatzacoalcos? So there they are. She had cattle on board. I don't have pictures of cattle being loaded, so you have to imagine those horses are cattle. Anyway, she sank. They saved all the men on board. The cattle went down with the ship. So there endeth the Peerless's performance here. So Northerner, there's a fleet of 3 vessels that ran from Ogdensburg, New York on the St. Lawrence River up to Lewiston on the Niagara River. So up the St. Lawrence across Lake Ontario to Niagara. They're all too large for the canals. They're all sitting around for a while because their company has gone bankrupt. So Northerner is the first one out of the gate here, and it had cost about $150,000 when it was new in 1849. So you're looking at a 12-year-old wooden hull that has been sitting around for a while. Any sailors with a wooden hull that hasn't moved anywhere for 3 years? They were really concerned just what kind of shape she was in, and it was sold to the government, but people were kind of suspicious. It was also in that hurricane going around Cape Hatteras, where they had put 1,450 berths on that. I don't know how many regiments you can fit in for that, but they've described it as our overloaded old vessel with more than 1,000 men on board had been laid up quietly rotting for some years before she was bought by the government. In the gale of November 12th, the old Northerner was wallowing in the heavy sea, and her course had become very erratic. 1 minute heading to the sea, the next rolling in the trough. Most of the officers and men were too seasick to care much what happened, but General Reno went to the pilot house, found the captain drunk, and put him, tied him up, gave command to the mate. And she had some mechanical problems as we should going. So the Northerner there had been bought for $70,000. There was a congressional investigation to why they had paid for this thing, and what supplies had been repairs have been put into it. I mentioned that they had taken the Hatteras Inlet very early. This is the course correction through Hatteras Inlet. So that was from a chart from a few years before, but on a daily basis, that track changes because it's tide, it's sand, and things are just shifting around all the time. So she started in on the 16th of January, and they finally got her through on the 26th of January, having run aground twice, having bashed into some schooners, and having to offload all of the people that they had stuffed on board her and all of their equipment in order to get her off the bottom. New York, same fleet, about the same size, a little bit younger, 234 feet in length. So she's longer than the Peerless. She's shorter than America. And she'd been laid up. These are original photographs from a stereo view in my collection. That's 1860, 1859, something like that. Anyway, she was chartered initially for $600 a day. She had exactly the same problem. The best case scenario for getting through that inlet was with a 7-foot draft. She showed up with 8'2", which was not enough to get through. And Burnside was ready to hang him, the captain there, but they unloaded everybody, got her through, and off they went to the Battle of Roanoke Island, which is, but New York has a much more interesting experience the rest of the war, involved with the evacuation after the Peninsula Campaign. You can see it set up as a hospital ship there. But for much of the war, she was the flag of truce ship that would sail from the Potomac down around and up the river towards Richmond, and that's where she is. So she could come up as far as City Point or Atkins Island. You can see in the upper left corner of this particular picture there, that pins on Richmond. So a long way to Richmond as the flag of truce vessel. So a long way up the James there. The York is the next one up. The Rappahannock is right at the top of that screen, and the Potomac is the next river, major river north of that. So there are pictures here of her taking people out of New York, or excuse me, on the New York out of Washington. This particular group was a group of Southern sympathizing women, which were, there are some hints that they were ladies of negotiable affection. And they stole all the blankets when they got off the ship. So the purser was not happy. Here we have a line of prisoners of war marching down at Aiken's Landing there to get on board to come back north. And some of them were in seriously poor physical condition. You can see there on the right, they always had doctors for these prisoner of war exchanges taking back. And here's a photograph of one of them once they had come back again. I see this and I start seeing Holocaust victims here at this particular point. So let's not go any further there. On to the third one of these vessels, same fleet, older still, rougher shape. It came down in 1962, again, run down the rapids of the St. Lawrence, and it was signed up, chartered for the Banks expedition. The Banks expedition, General Banks by this point was in New Orleans, and he was supposed to work his way up the Mississippi to Vicksburg, to join Grant in Vicksburg. So they were going all the way to the Gulf, and a group of the men who were on the lower deck were reaching up into the timbers of the deck overhead, reaching into the timbers of the deck overhead and pulling out rot. And they forced the captain to take them in through the Chesapeake Canal and took her up to Philadelphia, at which point there was a congressional inquiry into why did we charter this rotting piece of this rotting hulk, basically risking our fine men, because they're supposed to go all the way to New Orleans, remember? And so in the investigation, here is a diagram that a shipwright drew of the deck framing. Okay. Don't see those very often. Here's a picture of the deck framing with some hints. Let me just zoom in a little bit here, because otherwise all those red lines on that, you can see the red lines there towards, I mean, I'm just showing you the forward section here. Those are all where the shipwright said, we need to put in at least a second timber bolted to the first one to keep the deck up. So the Senate said, don't pay the charter. You should refuse to pay the charter. You know, it's being, there's $30,000 at stake here. Don't pay it. So here she is down, the government bought it and changed the name to Suffolk so that the Senate wouldn't know that they were dealing with the Niagara. So it's involved in the second battle of the Sabine Pass in September 1863. So there's a picture somebody drew of that, but here's a plan of that. The lower right box there, that's where she went aground, because she couldn't get into the Sabine River. There's another vessel that got just a little bit further. It was a total debacle. They retreated, but she had the headquarters staff on board, so she was the most luxurious, apparently, of what they sent off with Franklin on that fleet, and spent the rest of the war quietly rotting in the lower Mississippi River, and the bones are somewhere in the Delta, in the Bayou, probably. And after the war, the person who chartered the government court case sued for his money and got it, to everybody's disgust. Anyway, moving on. Maple leaf. If this picture looks a little fuzzy, my apologies. That's from a daguerreotype that was taken in 1858, I believe. And the original of that portion of the picture was less than an inch long. So that is super maxed there. It was built Canadian. It was ran between Coburg and Rochester, where it was there was some notoriety for actually taking people who were trying to avoid the draft by 1863. So they took it down to the coast and claimed it was American. So there was no transfer of flag here. They just said it's American. Well, okay. It's the maple leaf, remember? You know, the picture on my flag. Okay. Anyway, Captain Dale took her down, and she was actually transporting Southern prisoners of war north, and they seized the vessel, turned it around, took the lifeboats, rowed ashore in Virginia. And the punchline in this particular story was the fact that one of the officers was the son of the captain of, here they're saying, the pirate Alabama, you know, the Confederate raider Alabama that was running around the Atlantic messing with craft. So anyway, his son was an officer that escaped via the Maple Leaf. It was used later in the war in the campaign that seized Jacksonville and was making its way up, aka south, on the St. John River. They were in Pulaski. She was transporting goods from there back to Jacksonville. At night, I ran into one of those things, which they were calling torpedoes, that most of us in the 20th century think of as mines. Okay? Ran into one of those, and there you can see a sketch of her sunk in the St. Johns River. So decks up, bottom, it's not very deep there. They did some work a few years ago and salvaged a significant amount of stuff from there. So if any of you are Civil War collectors, you may or may not have encountered the possibility of acquiring some things that were salvaged from the wreck of the Maple Leaf. I think it's 20% of what they found that was turned over to the state of Florida, and some of it you can see if you're on the St. Johns River at Mandarin Point, which is where she went down. They have a lovely little museum there with a really interesting display of Maple Leaf and a bunch of things that a longer version of this presentation would have more of, but we won't. Anyway, I'm going to move on now to a couple more Great Lakes tugs, the Mary Grande and the Maria, depending on where you come from in the world, which were tugs built for the Winslows in Cleveland in the summer, or launched in the summer of 1863. Going to do all of the things that big tugs do. So it was going to tow schooners filled with iron down from Marquette. They were going to tow vessels through the St. Clair and the Detroit. They were going to tow rafts. They were going to do salvage with these things. They did almost none of that because in the fall of 1863, they sold it and they were taken down the river. The advantage with tugs, of course, you can fit through the Welland Canal and the St. Lawrence Canal. So you didn't have to run the rapids, and heaven knows you didn't want to go over Niagara Falls. So they were put up for sale the following spring. They were bought by the U.S. Navy and renamed. So it became the Begonia and the Clematis. There are other names other ways that people say that, but that's what you're going to get from this Canadian. And the first thing they did once they were taken into the Navy is they towed the Monitor Mahopic down to the Potomac. So there's Mahopic there. So she was towed down. And then they sent this Great Lakes tug, Clematis, off to join the blockading squadron off Cape Fear, off Fort Fisher, which is, you know, the river, the mouth where Wilmington, North Carolina is. Remember the Uncle Ben? It's up the river somewhere. Anyway, Clematis is part of this, and they're going to have it on duty in the blockade as a chaser. They're going to chase down blockade runners with a tug. I'm not aware that they caught any, okay? Finally, on the Union side, I just wanted to include the LNS Terry, which was built for another service, but spent most of the war running between New York and New Bern. So it went through the Hatteras Inlet each way once a week. So that one that Northerner and New York struggled with, and they had to put the troops ashore. Terry went in and out, in and out, in and out. Now they had a local pilot they took on every time who knew what the sands looked like today, because that's important. Anyway, Terry is get in there close enough. That one. And if not the next issue of Inland Seas, because it's all going to be about the Fitz, but the one after that, Carrie tells me an article that I wrote on the Terry will be there because after the war, she came to the lakes and was renamed the Don M. Dickinson and was a lumber tug on Lake Huron for a period of time. And then at her end, she was doing salvage work for the Westcotts. Because you think of Westcotts in the mail, but they were into all sorts of other stuff and salvage for a period of time. And then she burned off Bell Island. So let's talk about some that were engaged on the Confederate side. And this is one of my favorite stories. I will confess, this is not one that Heil didn't have anything about the tugs in here. And I just love the tug stories. So this is A.C. Gunnison, which was built in Philadelphia, was brought up the Hudson River, the Erie Canal to the Oswego Canal, across Lake Ontario, up the Welland Canal, all the way around to Chicago. And she was a Chicago tug for a couple of years. And then the owner was a very famous man in maritime circles in Chicago for many years, but early in his career, took her down the canal to the Mississippi, down to New Orleans, and across to Mobile, where she was towing just immediately before the Civil War, she was towing from Mobile 30 plus miles to get vessels out to sea and vice versa. So at the beginning of the Civil War, Dunham left and went back north again. The tug was taken over by some people who thought they could turn it into a privateer, a 62-foot tug going out to capture Union schooners and other kinds of things sailing around the Caribbean. They got a letter of marque to go and do that. They had what the Confederate government considered was a privateer. You're not a pirate, you're a privateer. The Union thought they were pirates because they didn't recognize the government, right? So you could hang as a privateer because if you were a pirate, except they couldn't get any jury in the North to hang them. That's another story. Anyway, so she's going to be a privateer, but not for very long. She's bought then by the Confederate Navy. So she becomes the CSS Gunnison. And the Confederate Navy, after a while, has somebody had the bright idea. He wasn't going to do this, but he thought this would be a really good idea. So they stuck a 20-foot spar off her bow. Okay, which you can see there's a chain there to raise and lower it, so nothing happens when you bang into some waves here. But there's 20 feet off her bow. This is a 62-foot boat, so you can imagine how far away you are at the stern. At the end of this, there is a barrel of somewhere between 100 and 150 pounds of gunpowder with 3 triggers sticking off the end. And the idea is it's going to steam out of Mobile Bay, go up at night in the dark of night, and ram into the side of one of the blockading Union naval vessels and blow a hole in the side. The problem was getting somebody to be the engineer on that as it went out there, because they didn't think the idea was all that bright. And the Confederate Navy turned around and thought they had volunteers to go and do this, who were aware of this particular bright idea. And I have no evidence that it was ever actually attempted. What Gunnison did do was lay those mines, those torpedoes, so that when Admiral Farragut starts the Battle of Mobile Bay, okay, what did Farragut have to say as they're approaching Mobile Bay? Something more. Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. At least that's what he's supposed to have said. I have a strong belief that someone who was a career naval officer probably just didn't say damn the torpedoes, but that this has been sort of like Nixon, expletive deleted, and somebody's filled in the blanks. Anyway, so she laid the torpedoes that concerned Farragut and the officers subordinate to him that were hesitating about going through the minefield. Anyway, Gunnison stayed in Mobile Bay, and when the Union, and this is very late in the war, March and April of 65, finally take Mobile. It retreated up the rivers north of Mobile, and it's trapped some miles up the Alabama River. Moving along, Salvar, which is another tug that was on the upper lakes. It was built as an insurance tug for Lake Michigan. The insurance companies sold it off because they weren't making money either. And they sold it to James Mackay, who was British in origin, but he had come over and he bought land in Tampa, Florida, where he was ranching. Who knew that you ranched in the Tampa area in the 1850s? I didn't. Anyway, so he bought Salvar, took it. This is an article from Scientific American, and he added, lengthened it to 183 feet. It was small enough again to go down the canals. And then did some other work, but what he wanted was a cattle boat. So he turned this Great Lakes salvage tug into a cattle boat that he's running between Tampa Bay and Cuba. And along the way, supplying Fort Taylor on Key West and Fort Jefferson out in the Tortugas. So he's on his way back there in May of 1861, as things are starting to heat up. And Major French there at Fort Taylor wants a bunch of Confederate sympathizers off his island, and he puts them on board Salvar. Didn't change the name, despite the fact that she wasn't doing any well, she did a bit of salvage work actually in Florida. I take it back. She stopped at Tampa for wood, and Captain Hartstein, who has defected from the Union Navy to the Confederate Navy, he looks at her and says, she's too slow, she's too deep, we don't want her for the Navy. So what does Mackay do? But he goes down under a flag of truce to Key West and says, Captain Taylor, do you want this for the Union? Okay. No, they didn't want to buy Salvar. On the other hand, you can take some of that beef on the hoof there over to Fort Jefferson on the Tortugas. And then he was allowed to sail down to Havana. And this is where things get really interesting with Salvar. So it's in Havana. It has all sorts of mechanical problems. And so they're there for a while fixing things. They say it was sold to someone from Britain, and they say it is renamed. The Union government doesn't believe this. And it loaded goods, they said, for Nassau. Now, when you look at the pins there, so there is Havana there in the lower left of there at the edge of Cuba, and you see the furthest west pin north of it is where she seized. Nassau's way over there, and she is not on a course for Nassau. Why is that? Well, they say it's because we have slaves that were working on the ship. People who were enslaved, if they ended up in Nassau in the Bahamas, which is British, it's like taking the Underground Railroad to Canada, they'd be free. We won't want them to be free, so we're going to put them ashore in slave state Florida, they said. They were making 2 miles an hour. If you're going to run the blockade, you want to be doing better than 2 miles an hour, okay? So they're stopped by the USS Keystone State. Now, Keystone State has orders to find the Confederate privateer Sumter, which was, it was captured a year later. Keystone State didn't find it. Part of why they didn't find it is because they took Salvar and then decided to take it all the way around to, they search and they find pistols, knives, revolvers, carbines, and percussion caps, which are really useful things for a war. The sort of thing you might want to run through the blockade. And yeah, they might have been legitimate cargo for Nassau, so other blockade runners could take it. But the point of fact is pretty clear where that was headed. So he took her into Key West, but he didn't trust the prize court in Key West. So he took her in tow all the way around to Philadelphia at the same time as that hurricane that sank Peerless. Okay. So there's some question as to where they're going to lose this. And very much off station. So Scott, who is a Virginian, by the way, who's Commander Scott, is in fact court-martialed and suspended for 6 months. Now, don't cry for Commander Scott. When he retired 9 years after the Civil War was over, he was commander of the North Atlantic Squadron of the U.S. Navy. So he was the admiral in charge of the North Atlantic Fleet there. So 6 months suspension doesn't necessarily mean your career totally tanks, apparently. But moving on, Arabian. You saw Peerless in the left of this picture, left center before. That's Arabian. So same vessel running out of Toronto. It was the right size to run down the canals, but it had been designed to run down the rapids and come back the canals, which was the major typical route for the Royal Mail Line vessels of that period. Wooden hull. And it had been sent down to the Gulf of St. Lawrence again because of the crash of 57. They were looking for somewhere to make money. And in the spring of 1863, it was sold to parties of which it isn't clear, and it left it had mechanical problems, so it got boilers fixed there and cleared New York for Havana. Those clearances for Havana is code name for going to run the blockade. And it arrives in May in Nassau in the Bahamas and clears for St. John, New Brunswick, which is another code name for saying you're going to run the blockade. So Arabian was a blockade runner. It did a number of I'm sorry that this is so small for you on this particular screen. But what you have this is a cargo that was offered up for sale from an ad in the Daily Progress. And I'm going to step over to this side. We're dealing with sugar, molasses, mackerel, salmon, more sugar, a variety of things that are medicinal. Some fancy clothing, fancy hose, ladies' gaiters, matches, leather pipes, and then a whole variety of alcohol. Because, well, just because, I mean, you import alcohol, it makes sense. Anyway, what you won't see in that list anywhere are military supplies, because those would have been turned over to the military already. They would not be put up for public auction. So if you're wondering why other things aren't there. And then it was loaded up with cotton and was sent back out again. And in September, it sent out, and what it discovered was, oh, there's the blockading fleet. And it ran back. And that is Fort Fisher in the background at the end of the Cape Fear River downstream from Wilmington. And there's two vessels that are ashore that are steamboats. One of them is in this picture. I don't know if this is Arabian or this is the other one. So because they didn't know. A couple of other quick blockade runner stories. Rothsay Castle, which was built on the Clyde. It's an iron-hulled vessel. Was a successful blockade runner. Ran several times. More importantly, was never captured. And it went up to Halifax at the end of the war, and then was brought up onto the lakes, ran on Lake Ontario for a number of years, both under that name and a later name. Then we have the Little Ada, which was much smaller. Little Ada didn't run into a big river. Little Ada was small enough that when it ran the blockade, it ran into a creek that was behind a bayou that was about 10 miles north of Charleston. And there is an extended story about that I've written somewhere else, and there's just not time tonight to carry on any further with this. It was captured on its second run in. It was captured by the USS Gettysburg, which was an ex-blockade runner that had been captured. And some of the ex-blockade runners were some of the fastest vessels for chasing other blockade runners, and Gettysburg ran her down and forced her to surrender. Wasn't hard to get them to surrender, because these are all neutrals that are manning these ships, and it's like, okay, we surrender, trade us back, because these are not Confederates running these things. These are people hoping to profit from the war, quite honestly. It came to the lakes. It was taken into the U.S. Navy after the war. It was turned over to the U.S. Army, which brought her to the lakes to help in the Great Lakes Survey. The first survey of the lakes had two other vessels, and this was a third. Again, iron-hulled meant, amongst other things, you had much shallower draft, which you want for getting into these shallow ports. And you also want if you're going to do survey work. So it did that for a number of years, and then was sold as a tug both on the American side, it came back to the Canadian side just before World War One. Was sold back American after the war, ended up being converted into a tanker and is sunk in Long Island Sound in 1940. This was a well-lived bit of iron hull that had gone through a whole series of the stories for that go on and on. Then we have the letter B, which was known as Chikora for most of her career. She was built on the Mercy. Letter B, one of the other ones built for the same owners was the letter Go. So you get the idea. Somebody had a pun, but known as Chikora. Again, iron hulled, shallow draft, fast, successful, and it was brought up to the lakes after the war and had to be cut in two because she was too big to bring up the canals, whereas Little Ada was smaller, as was the Rossley Castle. And so she was rejoined on Lake Erie and spent the next number of years on the upper lakes, where we were. She has a major place in Canadian history. We put her on a stand. So the rest of her career, I won't. She finished off her career, frankly, running the same route that Peerless couldn't make money on. She was very successful on from the early 1880s up until after World War I, when she was converted into a tow barge. Remember I said we'd come back to the Uncle Ben near the end? We're near the end, okay? Honest. So there, we left her sitting in Wilmington with the engines taken out. So what do you do with a fairly large tug with no engine? Do you turn it into a schooner? They turned it into a schooner. And what can you do with a schooner sitting? You run the blockade. So they sailed out and they ran the blockade, and then they then renamed it Retribution and put her to work as a privateer. And at one point over the course of the winter of 1863, I've pinned a variety of places where she seized Union tonnage, whalers and other kinds of things. And typically she had to burn them, because one of the things, if you're a privateer, you have to take your capture to a prize court, which meant you had to run the blockade with your prize, which was really hard to do. So there was not a lot of money in privateering for a Confederate, quite honestly. And they gave it up as a bad job in Nassau after she'd been running most of the winter. Somebody bought it, repainted it, renamed it, pretended it was an entirely different vessel, loaded it up with pineapples, and took it in trade to New York City. And somebody said, wait a second, I know that hull. That's the Retribution, and the authorities seized it. So there endeth the privateer story. So as we're getting along here, let me conclude a few things here. There's everything that came from above Niagara Falls was a tug, because that's the only size of vessel you could get through the Welland Canal from that period. But there were some really big tugs that did that. It's striking to me how many of these people were that sold these vessels were struggling after 1857, and what was needed on the coast from some of those shallow entries were seaworthy but shallow draft vessels, and it was hard to find that combination of the two. What's also striking to me, as I noted at the beginning, is just how many of these were combined operations, so that the Union had all of these places around the coast that not only did they need to, naval support, but they had to move troops, and then they had to supply them and resupply them. And it's not just a case of, hauling beef on the hoof there, so you didn't have to eat salted food or salted meat all the time. You could actually have fresh meat because the butchers were there. But these transports, like the Ellen Terry and others, were stuffed full of mail bags coming and going. There are thousands of letters each week that would come out of New Bern, North Carolina, and those would appear in the paper routinely. So there's lots of delighted, and the folks that spent part of their time in that particular garrison in the after war, as they're telling the stories of what I did during the war. They talk about how excited it was to get mail and to send mail. And they would also be loaded down with newspapers. So the newspapers from home, the newspapers from New York. And again, on the flip side, lots of that turns back. So there's lots of accounts there, lots of work to support all of those garrisons. And the quartermaster general's office, who was managing those transports, got better at this over the course of the war. So by the end of the war, they were paying a fraction of what they were paying to charter vessels at the beginning of the war. They just got smarter. They knew what they were doing, and they did a better job of not chartering things like Niagara. You know, ones where you could reach into the hull and pull out some rotten timber. So better inspection. But there was a massive Army transport fleet. So we've only touched the edges of this, the stuff that came down from the lakes. There were the quartermaster was managing a fleet of over 1,000 vessels. So I mean, you think about it though, in some of those World War II campaigns in the Pacific, again, there's a tremendous number of Army vessels that are in the Pacific that don't get the credit because we're all talking about Admiral Halsey and the submarines and those kinds of things, the aircraft carriers. But the Army, the land troops that were involved, it's not all Marines. There's a big fleet in the Pacific. Anyway, so I just come back to this in terms of the fact that an army marches on its stomach, and part of the challenge in all of these things is to make sure that they have the food and the drink and the rest of that they need to get through and defend those spaces that have been taken. Lots of this, the quartermaster general, you know, supporting the troops that are in the land campaigns, but the logistics of this are just that much more complicated. So I'm going to leave you with a cartoon here and ask then, are there any questions? Okay. So for those who are online, Admiral Farragut may not have actually said damn the torpedoes, but Tom Petty certainly did. Yes. Carrie, do we have any questions online?
So knowledgeable. No, I mean.
Yes. Where in Florida is that museum that has the artifacts that were recovered from the Maple Leaf and this wonderful little model of the Maple Leaf? It's in Mandarin Point, which is south of Jacksonville on the east side of the St. John River. So it's well down in Florida. I don't know if you're getting towards St. Augustine by that point. My Florida geography is not as strong as I would wish it would be. But yeah, it's down. Yes.
Tugboat being a schooner, just in terms of what tugboat hull looks like versus what a good schooner's hull looks like, and not to mention that a tugboat is going to be fairly deep draft. Anyway, that's not really a question, just more of a statement of my ability to understand what's going on.
I have never understood really why they would have wanted to convert the Uncle Ben into a schooner there and what her sailing qualities would have been there. But she actually ran, as a schooner, she actually successfully ran the blockade once before she went wandering around the Caribbean, causing anxiousness, fear, havoc. And at one point, in terms of retribution, she was getting as much press as Alabama was getting. There was as much anger about her being out and about, and they would call her the pirate, and all sorts of other, mid-Victorian newspaper epithets that, things that you could print but not be pleasant at the same time, kind of things. Pirate was probably the least of them in some ways. Yes. What are the prize courts? Okay. So if you are, I will, why don't I explain it in terms of the context of the Ada? Because the Ada was seized by the USS Gettysburg. So she's seized by a naval vessel. If you were a privateer and you had what was called a letter of marque, that's M-A-R-Q-U-E, it's very French. If you had a letter of marque, that allowed you to do the same thing. But in order to legally, by sort of international law, benefit from the proceeds of this, you had to take it to an admiralty court somewhere, which is a special court that could, and they would sit as a prize court. And so they would look at, first of all, the circumstances of the seizure, to make sure that it had been done right. Okay, and I won't get into that because life is too short. But at that point, they could say that is a legal prize that has been taken. It can then, it's then offered up at auction along with its cargo, which often is even worth much more than the hull was. The blockade runners wouldn't have ever used enslaved people. And the reason for that is because they could get a white could be transferred back. I mean, he's essentially a non-combatant there from those two. Criminal, non-combatant, definitely. So you wouldn't see typically men of color in these crews. So I'm not. There may be cases where, but if they were brought into a prize court in the north, that wouldn't. I don't think there would be any value. Different story before the Civil War. I mean, that's a whole different era in terms of the jurisprudence. So the court would then authorize the sale and would take a percentage of the sale as its fees, because what government agency doesn't want to charge a fee? And having done that, then there was a formula in the Navy. There was a formula in terms of who got the prize money. So there was a package then that was on offer, and typically it was divided up by rank. So officers got more than the ordinary seamen, and I'm not sure, but I suspect it was as true in the U.S. Navy as it was in the Royal Navy, that the officer in charge of the fleet also got his percentage. So if you got to be admiral of the fleet, you just sent your guys off to take prizes, because that was helping pay for the mansion back home.
So one is privateer, another is private, right?
If you
Yes.
if you have a letter of marque, officially you're a privateer unless your government is not recognized. So if the Union government did, and there was a point after which they recognized the privateer and the letter of marque partly because some of the very early seizures were taken up to New York. The men were put on trial as pirates, and the jury was hung. The jury was hung, not the crew. And they were hung because they didn't think they should be treated. They were enemy combatants rather than criminals. So the bottom line is that it would all be divided up between people, and so being in the Navy was one way to make serious money if you had a nice, long, profitable war and you could make a number of Caesars. So the folks who were crewing the Gettysburg were really thrilled because they had a fast hull, and they were in blockade runner infested waters there. So they took a number of prizes. There were a couple of others that did very well out of taking prizes. The Clematis did not. But then again, she was Tug, right? Going out chasing things, but not necessarily with great success. Yes, Carrie.
First statement, someone mentioned it's the first time they've ever heard reference to the tragically hip in a presentation. Seems very pleased by that. Question, did Canadians profit from blockade running during doing trade with the Confederates?
Okay,
American Navy and Confederate Navy, but where are the Canadians in all of this too?
First of all, I would just note that there are a couple of Canadian vessels that I left out of the presentation in order to get it in time. So this could have been an hour and a half. And we weren't sure that I mean, these are really comfortable seats, and I'm glad to see everybody awake. I'm thrilled whenever I see that. You may have fallen asleep online, but here at least everybody seems to be awake. So the short version of this is what Canadians were largely doing was unloading unprofitable hulls on somebody who would pay for it. And to the best of my knowledge, the exception to that was the Bowmanville, which, as I said, I took a couple out of the presentation. But Now that we're here, quick version of the story of the Bowmanville. It was also running between Montreal and Toronto at one point. It was wooden hulled. It wasn't making money. It was sold. The person who bought it then offered it to the Quartermaster General as a Union transport. They were, by the way, he said, and if you take it, I want $25,000 real money, none of this greenback stuff. Because back in those days, the exchange rate was such that greenback was worth about 75 cents Canadian. That is not what I paid to buy an American dollar to come down here, by the way. Yes. Greenbacks, inflation in the US was a major issue towards the end. And frankly, after the Civil War, there's quite a discussion there. So he offered it for $25,000 of Canadian money. They didn't take it. So it was sold to a shipbroker that I've actually written about as well, George Wyatt. And Wyatt officially sold it to a gentleman by the name of Jimenez in Havana. But the register that it was then registered in Quebec because it needed to be registered in Quebec in order to go to sea as a British vessel. And it needed to be in the Imperial Registry, that in Montreal as well, but it's in Quebec. And there's this odd notation on her which said that he had 30 days to sell it as long as he didn't take less than $30,000 for it, which says to me that Wyatt was still on the hook. It doesn't really matter relative to Blockade running because it sank in its way south. So it's what happens when you have a tired old wooden hull and you put it into the North Atlantic. Sometimes it just doesn't get to where it's supposed to go. So did we profit by it? Only in terms of unloading old stuff.
One last question and then, we can wrap up. The gentleman says, it sounds like British North American neutrality was also a factor in creating the flexibility to move boats off the Great Lakes, but also elsewhere on the coast of the Caribbean. What do you think?
I mean, to my mind, it's key. You want to get this stuff out. As long as they're British hulls, they can go to sea. So in terms of getting it out there, and that would have been true other places as well. Yeah. So I mean, from British North America, from Canada, we're always very interested in what's going on down here because one of our prime ministers, like being in bed with an elephant, he rolls over. Yeah. The fact is that a lot of far more sympathy with the North in British North America than there ever was in the southern states there. So what you see are men going down to fight in the Union. Part of it, frankly, was it's tough times, and there were signing bonuses on offer, or there were people that would pay you in order to take their position. You could get somebody to send a substitute into the draft, and there was money on for doing that. So there's lots of Canadians who went south and are involved in more, like I said, 5 figures. So, I'd like to think, and this is simply my stand on the question of enslavement, is that we're on the side of the angels, by and large, in that. Which is not to say that people didn't find ways to make money out of the process, out of the Bahamas and Bermuda.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Walter. That was fantastic, as always. A couple of notes. First of all, next month we'll be here Wednesday, October 15th, where we will welcome Paul Lamar and Chris Winters, who will be discussing their research project on the history of the Shenango fleet. And if you all don't know about the Shenango fleet, there's a big green boat out there that was part of the Shenango fleet. Oh, and there's a pilot house that came off the Shenango fleet as well. So this is a talk that's very close to our hearts here. I do want to thank Impact Employment Solutions for sponsoring our fall lecture series. For those of you who didn't notice on the way in and want to on the way out, we do have our little micro store set up there with Becca. I believe she said the store out front is also fully open as well. So, if anybody's a little chilly because it's whatever, we've got some really lovely sweatshirts. As always, don't forget, if you aren't members, now is a great time to join at nmgl.org/membership. And don't forget, if you are a member, you get 10% off in the store. Who knew I was going to be a salesperson when I went to graduate school? Anyway, so that's it. Thank you everybody for being with us tonight. Stay healthy and safe, and we will see you all again in October.